Just got back, as many of you know, from what some call vacation, though I've come to believe that if you're in your 30s, 40s, if you have kids that are still at home, you don't have vacations. You don't take vacations, you take trips, right? Vacations are reserved for people who vacate, who leave and get away. So just preparing, all of you who are planning on having kids or raising kids, right, to give up vacations for a while. You will. You may take trips. We had some beautiful trips. We did. And they were vacations. And it's important to take vacations. It's important to vacate. And every time I go away, I remember why it's important to vacate, to leave, because you just see things differently. You hear things differently. You don't hear certain things. You hear other things. In fact, vacation is really all defined about hearing, about listening a little more deeply, right, to the things that were always there. But the noise of daily life, of our busy lives, just makes it hard to hear. And so we really did New England trips. We went to Maine, we went to New Hampshire, Storyland. I went on a 3-day silent retreat, which was a vacation, complete silence. But each of those vacations, the silence was disrupted, and not just by my kids, right? Profoundly disrupted, because many of you experienced the same disruption at least twice this past month, with tragedy, with horror. The first taking place in Colorado, in Aurora, Colorado, where that madman walks into the movie theater and opened fire and killed all of those innocent men, women, and children. And then the other one, of course, was the Sikh temple in Wisconsin, where again another madman, an evil individual, opened fire, killing all of those worshipers in a temple of all places. Really bringing unbelievable, horrific noise into those individuals' lives, ending lives, into those families' lives, taking loved ones into this world, right? All of that noise, that soul-disrupting noise. What do we do when that kind of horrific noise is brought into the world, is brought into our lives? What do we do with that noise? One of the things we Jews have always done, we've turned to Torah. We turn to our ancient texts to try and find some quiet, some solitude, to make sense of the chaos, to make sense of the noise. And that's a beautiful thing, except when you look at this week's Torah portion and next week's Torah portion. At least for me, and I think probably for many, if not all of you, there's a lot more noise here than there is solitude if you read this week's Torah portion, if you read next week's Torah portion. It doesn't make the world less noisy for me to read what we read. What did we read? And when you enter the land of Israel, it will be because you heed mitzvot, commandments, and when you heed them, when you keep mitzvot, when you do commandments and perform them, God will keep his covenant with you, and he'll be kind to you, and he will love you, and he will bless you, and you will only know good things, in summary, and you will not know bad. To put it simply, this week's Torah portion and next week's Torah portion say, if you do mitzvot, if you do commandments, you get good things. And if you fail to do them, if you stray from them, you get bad things. And that's nice and it's simple. The problem is it's just not true. It's not true from the way we look at life from a modern sensibility. Maybe it worked for our ancestors. I'm not sure it did. But it doesn't work for us. It certainly doesn't work for me. Right? It doesn't work to explain away evil. What did those people in the Sikh temple do? Right? What did they do to deserve the loss of life, the havoc that was wreaked upon them? What did Suveg Singh Katra, who was 84, a dairy farmer, do to deserve losing his life? Well, what did he do? He went every morning to their temple, right? We call it shul, they call it temple. He went every morning. He was devout. He prayed. He would prepare meals at the temple for others. His life was taken. Was it because he didn't do enough mitzvot, enough commandments? What about Paramajit Kaur, who was 41, a young mom, taken away from her 2 sons? This was a woman who was devout in her faith, also there taking care of the needy, always there for people according to accounts about her. What did she do? What did the 12 victims in Aurora, Colorado do to deserve the loss of life? Little 6-year-old Veronica Moser Sullivan was killed going to a Batman movie. Right? Was it because she didn't do enough tzedakah, give enough charity? I can't believe in a God that would impose a punishment upon people for not doing enough commandments or even doing bad things I don't personally believe in a God that visits tragedy upon people for not fulfilling enough commandments. I frankly don't think the Torah actually meant that. I don't read the Torah oftentimes for theology. This week's Torah portion, to me, bad theology. However, I choose Judaism. I return to Torah because there are multiple layers and levels. I think it's bad theology this week, but I think it's great psychology. What do we read in this week's Torah portion? We read about mitzvah. Mitzvah means commandment. We all know it means commandment. However, the Aramaic root from which it comes doesn't mean commandment. Mitzvah comes from the Aramaic savta, which means connection. What happens when you read this from a psychological perspective? Changes everything. When you live a life of mitzvot, of connection to community, connection to Torah, timeless truths, connection to rituals like prayer, connections to God, something bigger than ourselves. When you live a life of connection, nothing can deter you. Nothing can cut you off. No matter how bad it gets, no matter what the universe, what the world brings to us, if we live a life of connection, as the rabbis say, mitzvah goreret mitzvah. One connection leads to another connection, leads to another, and pretty soon we have a certain foundation upon which we've created. Will bad things happen to you if you're connected, living a life of Judaism, living a religious life? Yes, bad things will still happen to you. Tragedy will probably still fall upon you. Maybe even evil will rear its ugly head and you'll have to bear witness to it, God forbid, but maybe it'll happen. Does it mean if you live a life of mitzvah that this won't happen? No. It means if you live a life of connection to these core values and truths, you'll be better prepared to deal with the disruption, to deal with the chaos, to deal with the tragedy if and when it comes. What do we read in this week's Torah portion? If you live a life of connection, Lo ta'arotz mipnehem ki Adonai Elohecha b'kirbecha el gadol v'norah. If you live a life of connection to all of these good things, God, community, ritual, Torah, values, you shall not be terrified when bad things happen to you. God is with you. God is awesome. God is great. And the Lord your God will drive out the evil from your midst eventually, me'at, me'at, little by little. When you live a life connected to all of these truths, even when evil comes upon you, you don't have to be cut off. You don't have to flee in terror or panic like many of the men and women in that Sikh temple. There are incredible stories of faith and heroism that I've been reading about over the past couple weeks. That woman, Paramajit Kaur, that 40-year-old young mom, her sons told about how she was with her aunt in the temple when the shooter opened fire. And she saw there was a mad dash or mad rush, panic to the doors, to the exits. And so instead of being one of those who understandably was rushing for the door, she stood her ground. She bowed one more time in prayer, let other people exit. And as she turned to leave after that final bow, she was killed. She put herself in harm's way so that other people could live. Her deep connection to God was never severed, was never broken, and this terrorist could not take that away from her. What about Satawant Singh Kalika, who was 62 years old? He was the president of the temple. They found his dead body. Next to it, they found a pocket knife. He had tried to kill the terrorist, to try and stop him with a pocket knife, right? He could have fled. Somebody said, one of the victims who escaped said he could have fled, but instead he chose to stand his ground. And the word sing means lion. And it said in this article, the gurus have taught for 500 years that to be to be a lion, to be a part of the Sikh tradition means to be faithful, to stand your ground, to stand for justice, just like Kalika did. His connection to God was never severed. The terrorist did not have the final word. And then you read about stories, great heroic stories in that movie theater. There are many of them, but three that stood out are almost identical. Three men who I don't think knew each other. I don't think they were there together. They were there with their girlfriends, I believe it was, their partner. And each one, when the shooter opened fire, threw himself in front of his girlfriend. Each one lost his life. Joe Blanc, Matt McQuinn, Alex Tevis. They used their bodies as a shield, right? The noise in that theater must have been horrific. I don't think most of us can imagine what it might have been like. I don't think we can imagine how horrible it was, but those men provided a moment of silence amidst the horror and the noise, right? Proving that the human spirit can be unconquerable, even if the body is conquerable. And the last moment of disruption of noise for me, and I think for many of you, was truly the lack of silence at the beginning of the Olympic Games. Right? I'm going to talk more about this. This is kind of a spoiler alert. A lot of this I'm going to talk about during the high holidays, but I have to talk about it because that was so jarring to me that on the 40th anniversary of the Munich Olympics, where the Munich 11, the 11 Israeli athletes were killed, that the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, couldn't allow for 1 minute of silence for the only atrocity to ever take place on Olympic soil, 40 years ago to the day. And the families of the victims of these Israeli athletes who were killed by Palestinian organization terrorists, Black September and PLO, killed these Olympians on Olympic soil. And the IOC said, no, we can't allow for a minute of silence. They had a couple moments of silence, and rightly so, for those who have fallen in World War I and II, and for those who had lost loved ones. They had moments of silence, but they couldn't have 60 seconds for silence for the victims of the Munich 1972 Olympics. And that was so jarring to me, the noise of that statement. Why they made that decision, I'll talk about later on. That's another conversation for the high holidays. But I don't want that to be the final word. I want to have a moment of silence in a few moments for the 11 Israeli athletes who, very much like Kalika and Kaur and the heroes in that movie theater, stood their ground. 40 years ago, Josef Gutfreund was a wrestling referee, and he was awakened by noise of the terrorists outside in the Olympic Village, and he heard them. And he heard them coming into the apartment where he was and the other Israeli athletes were staying. And he saw them wearing masks and their guns. And what did he do, this wrestler? He threw his body, 300 pounds, against the door and bought enough time for a couple of his compatriots, of his colleagues, to flee. He saved lives even though he lost his own. Wrestling coach Moshe Weinberg fought the intruders 40 years ago, the terrorists, held them off as Gad Sobari and others could escape. Weightlifter Yosef Romano attacked the terrorists and bought enough time for some of his fellow Olympians to escape. These were men who, in the end, lost their lives, but never lost their connection. Never lost their connection to their brothers, the fellow Olympians, never lost their connection to their people in Eretz Yisrael, never lost their connection to God. And that's inspirational. And that's the way we should live our life. And that's what I think Judaism and religion is here for, to teach us, to train us how to remain connected in a world that constantly wants to disconnect us in small ways and in unfortunately tragic and profoundly tragic ways from time to time. And so our job is to live a life like these great men and women, hopefully never being called to exemplify our courage and our fearlessness in the face of fear as did they. But if that time ever does come, to live out the words of this week's Torah portion, you shall not be terrified of them, of bad things, of bad people, because God is in your midst. To live a life like these great men and women, like these great Olympic heroes. So because the IOC decided not to allow for a minute of silence, I think at the very least what we can do as a Jewish community, as a synagogue, is take a minute and pay our tribute on this 40th anniversary to our brothers who fell 40 years ago in the Munich Olympics. So why don't we just take a moment and rise and send our love and our prayers to the families of these individuals and pay tribute to their holy neshamot that's now in Olam Haba. We remember Moshe Weinberg, Yosef Romano, Zev Friedman, Yosef Gutfreund, Eliezer Halfin, Kehat Shor, Yaakov Springer, Mark Slavin, David Berger, Andre Spitzer, Amitsur Shapira, and also the victims in Aurora, Colorado, and in Wisconsin in the temple. And our thoughts and prayers are with their families as we say a variation of Kaddish, one that Cantor Lana composed.
Please join me, don't be afraid of these words. Yehei Shemei Rabba Mevorach Le'olam Le'almei Almaya Yitkadash Ve'yitkadash Shemei Rabba Yehei Shemei Rabba Mevorach Le'olam Le'almei Almaya. Sing shalom with me. Shalom, 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 shalom. Keep going. Shalom, shalom, shalom,
May God bring a sense of peace, a sense of shalom to all of the bereaved of these families and anybody who's in a place of mourning or suffering or sorrow.